You have been preoccupied, to use a polite word, with studying the ways in which architects and planners have been complicit in devising military strategies in the whole settlement program in Israel, and you have been making a very interesting connection between architecture and crime, and in that context, and therefore it is inevitable to ask you what you think of the current events, that if anything seem to be an escalation of the already radical suffering that you have documented.
Yeah. I think I'm going to answer this question perhaps not as an architect, because I don't see the immediately the sort of the architectural dimension or the planning dimension of the conflict that is happening within Lebanon and Gaza right now. But it seems to me as well to be a product of a set of ideas and conceptions that have entered the Israeli military and the Israeli government recently. And I think somehow when we see that war and suffering and the refugees in Lebanon, we could be mistaken to understand that these are the byproduct of a campaign that seeks to uproot Hezbollah or to have any other objective. However, I think that there is a kind of a confusion of cause effect and side effect. I think that within the current military thinking, there is a desire to mobilize the West sort of sensitivity to humanitarian situation in order to intervene with Lebanese politics and the kind of the politics of the region. So I think that there is a very calculative move here that by which the kind of 700 or 800,000 Lebanese refugees are not the byproduct of that campaign, but actually their suffering is mediatized in a way that seeks to appeal to a Western consciousnness and to appeal to a form of intervention. In effect, there is a kind of a very cynical sort of a game which is being played on the back of civilians.
You mentioned that the complicitness of architects and planners in that whole process has now shifted to some extent, and that there is a specific interest on the part of the military in urban theory.
Yes.
And I think that's a kind of very important shift.
Yes. I think that the militaries, and not only the Israeli, but militaries around the world have gradually got to the understanding that most most conflict, most war is actually urban and primarily happening within third world cities. However, they had a kind of a gap of about 50...
Is or will be urban?
Already is, since the kind of the early 90s, the most conflict actually takes place in cities. However, both military doctrine and equipment is not geared to deal with that situation. Therefore, in an almost kind of panic move, the militaries around the world have started to set up a sequence of think tanks and institutions that are geared to study urbanism and to understand the way in which cities have developed and are still developing, the way in which they're growing, the way in which they reflect high degrees of contradictions and complexity in them, in order to understand how to operate within the urban environment. So I think to a large degree, and this here I'm probably quoting a British geographer who studied that phenomena as well, Simon Marvin, most urban research that takes place right now takes place by men in uniform in the military. So there's almost a kind of a shadow world to the one that we know, to the kind of network of elite or other architectural institutions which are relating to each other, which are sharing knowledge. there's a shadow world of military research institutes that are operating pretty much according to a kind of with a similar sort of ecology of conferences, publications, guest lectures, etc., where a lot of urban theory that
Do you know which theory, for instance?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of the urban theory that has become instrumental by militaries is actually the kind of what we were used to think as a subversive theories that were conceived around 68. So, for example, and I know here it's been discussed quite a lot, situationist theory, the work of Deleuze and Guattari, other sort of so-called radical left theory that used to understand the city as the locus of a kind of a repression, the sort of the post-war repression of the city that needs to be transgressed to a certain degree. That kind of form of transgression is now completely being abused and actually articulated by military thinkers as attack on the enemy city. So that if kind of a lot of the situationist project was actually trying to kind of to undo, to see gaps and kind of subvert bits of the urban environment, that is exactly the kind of the toolbox which is being thought and
so
used.
So it's a derive as a military maneuver?
In a kind of a roundabout way, yes. If you, I mean, initially one has to kind of to differentiate between the sort of the field of knowledge which is now assembled and discussed within militaries that include readings such as I said, as well as architectural theory. Again, a kind of a very important reference is Bernard Schumi's the Manhattan Transcript, which I've actually had one Israeli brigadier general who has translated that book to Hebrew, claim that the kind of system of notation that has been provided there is much more adequate to plan sort of attack on an urban environment than any other tools that the military has. I know it sounds completely bizarre to the degree of being hysterical, but there is that particular institute and other institutes like it that are using this and other post-structuralist theories in order to conceive of methods to now transgress the enemy city, so to speak. I mean, their problem is that they cannot come now or overtly in a way in which urban warfare was conducted 50 years ago, and that is a kind of a complete sort of carpet bombing. But they have to sort of start manipulating different elements that already exist within the city, different conflicts that the city actually kind of frame between particular and a variety of different groups that are in it. The presence of media, the presence of humanitarians. It becomes an incredibly sort of complicated field, and somehow they've realized that the toolbox they've had before is completely inadequate in order to kind of operate within the environment now.
I was curious to know more about the mapping, because we've spoken a lot about mapping in the last sort of 20 hours, and you have actually written before about the sort of geometry of the occupation, and that can only somehow be perceived or understood in a three-dimensional kind of understanding. And I sort of wondered if you can explain this to us, how this conflict can actually be mapped three-dimensionally.
Yeah, I mean, initially that project was conceived as a human rights project that I undertook with an organization called B'Tselem, where the aim was to implicate the work of architects and planners in the mechanism of occupation, but not as collaborators within it. I mean, not the fact they have taken commission within a kind of an, so to say, evil system, but could we actually relate the very architectural methodologies that they've been using, the way they've been drawing maps on plans, the way in which a kind of a road is made to curve, the way in which a settlement is made to bend and to, in a sense, cut and bisect, create wedges through the environment. So that led to a kind of a long process of collection of architectural plans that took more than a year, where we were basically kind of jumping out from one settlement committee to another and kind of assembling that plans in order to again to relate the very architectural methods with an intention, a kind of a negative intention to dominate the area. So here there was a kind of a clear sort of implication of the very methodologies of architecture. Another part of the way that I work is that I kind of tend to see architectural research not as something that produces a kind of a toolbox for, kind of look at something, make it a concept, the concept turns into a tool, the tool is going to be applied in a building somewhere else, but as a form of witnessing, right? I think that when you are dealing with a situation that is horrific to such a degree, your kind of instead of sort of architecture being an interventionist praxis, it becomes a form of professional testimony, of producing professional testimony. So in that respect, we were kind of starting to look at situations which were not directly architectural, but perhaps geopolitical through architectural sort of framework, and therefore the kind of the three-dimensional or the politics of verticality as a sort of an understanding of the conflict has emerged, where it seems that both kind of people that were working for the occupation forces and people that were trying to offer solutions for it started to imagine Jerusalem in particular and the West Bank in general not as a sort of a flat surface on which things are kind of placed, but as a three-dimensional reality where the kind of the subterranean, anything which is under the surface is seen as a different constituency than the surface of the terrain, and again the airspace over it is seen differently. I mean, you can see that now in the evacuation of Gaza, which is effectively Israel and the IDF have evacuated the surface of the terrain. Everything over it, the airspace, is still Israel's sovereign territory. The aquifers under it are still, to a certain degree, through a very complex bureaucratic process, rule or kind of regulated by Israel, so that in effect you are kind of having to start to imagine a territory and borders not only as lines on maps, but as things which enclose volumes.
I was also curious to know more how actually the reading, three-dimensional reading of these maps gets translated or enters the world of exhibitions, because you've actually organized exhibitions and I was
actually
curious to know more about how that sort of translates into display features and into
Sure.
exhibitions.
Sure. The beginning of the project, or the moment the kind of the project took another sort of life was, and I think somehow it must have sort of coincided with a developing sensitivity in the art world to such situations. And after the banning of an initial exhibition, a very small exhibition that we were planning to do in representing Israel in Germany, we have got a lot of somehow money to conduct research, and somehow our relationship with the art world initially became quite parasitic, in a sense that all of a sudden there was that interest, there were these institutional bodies that were willing to finance research that was very difficult to finance before. But somehow through the process of spatializing it, of putting it in space, working with curators and people that have a different sort of sensitivity to the visual, to the different way of analyzing images, I'm happy to say that a lot of the kind of the sensibilities that existed in the art world were folded into the project itself. So what initially started as a quite parasitic kind of project ended up as a quite fruitful collaboration somehow.
There was a moment where it seemed possible to use the moment of transition and withdrawal from Gaza as the occasion of an intervention there.
Yeah.
and of you could say an appropriation of a settlement for a Palestinian institution.
Yes.
What has happened to that effort?
Well, the effort is kind of, the entire kind of complexity of that project has been flattened into the rubble of the settlements now. But there was a, throughout this conflict, there's still moments of optimism where kind of the mode of our work shifts from a kind of a witnessing, a professional testimony, to a mode of intervention. And there was a kind of an opening where few months before, leading to the August 2005 evacuation in Gaza, the entire world seemed to have been interested in architecture. You had the World Bank, the IMF, the Americans even put in kind of discussing what to do with the buildings that will be left in the settlements. And somehow the kind of those silly-looking house and garden suburbia has become a kind of a part of a geopolitical game. At that moment, together with my colleagues from the Palestinian Ministry of Planning, with which I was working already since '95, there was a commission to think about a form of inhabiting this sort of evacuated colonial architecture in a way that would not reproduce exactly the same kind of hierarchies in space. I mean, the problem is when colonial architecture or architecture of power is evacuated across the colonial world, many times it has been abused by the newly formed national regime in a very similar way to the way it's been used by the colonialists, so that the villas become villas, the prisons are staying in prison, the military camps are military camps. And here there was an attempt to actually liberate those suburbs and use somehow the militarized geography that kind of networked them with very massive highways. It created a kind of a network of suburbs through Gaza, and to kind of to convert them into a kind of a matrix of public institutions. And therefore a kind of a process of translation has begun where the very mundane sort of outline of suburbia was, we were looking in it for potential to actually spatialize into it things like a university, a medical center, an agricultural training center, and a cultural center, each one a different suburb, each being one of those new programs. And the question was how such a kind of such a program could spatialize itself into that very familiar, somehow mundane suburban form. And in effect, it kind of the plans somehow in a sense reflected on a possible transformation of those institutions themselves. And kind of the fantasy was that in a sense, if the settlements are nothing but a kind of exaggeration of very known, banal, mundane sort of typologies that are being put in that extreme situation, is it not somehow a kind of a way to sort of speculate about the future of suburbia at large, right? So there was kind of this wild sort of speculation at the time, and I was happy that we could discuss that at this moment.
I have one more question. You're now here in London. What are you doing at Goldsmith? What is the intention of your program?
There is a new program that we've set up. As a matter of fact, we just completed the first year of it. It's a PhD and MA in what they call research architecture, and somehow it kind of that format has allowed us to think the limitation of graduate architectural education, that it somehow seems locked between the kind of a very professional American, either sort of professional in terms of design, or the kind of the professional theories, the sort of custodians of knowledge that are produced in places such as Princeton and other places in the States, with a kind of a more sort of robust action-based research. So in a sense, it's a practice-driven theory course. The idea is that it's action-based research in a sense that we understand that in order to kind of force a system to reveal itself, you have to interact with it to a certain degree. So it's very sort of propositional, but it is propositional as a form of research.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Many thanks.